Nowadays, mindfulness meditation is generally presented as an unproblematic part of Buddhist practice, as though everyone always sort of agrees about what mindfulness really is from within a Buddhist context. However, I think if we look to history, if we look to the suttas, if we look to different places, we'll find slightly different interpretations as to what really counts as mindfulness. And so that's what I want to discuss, one aspect of that anyway, in today's video, which is the question as to whether mindfulness is universally wholesome or not. Some teachers, for example, will say that if you become angry or if you become sleepy, that's to say that you have lost mindfulness. That's because it's said that mindfulness cannot co-arise with unwholesome mental states such as those. Now, what are unwholesome mental states? Well, that's a big topic, but one very famous example of unwholesome mental states are what are known as the 5 hindrances. These are 5 kinds of mental states that are considered to be hindrances to effective meditation, in particular, perhaps, effective mindfulness meditation. Now, what are these 5? They include sense desire, anger, restlessness and remorse, sleepiness and doubt. These are the 5 hindrances, and it's said that they cannot, at least by some, that they cannot co-arise with real mindfulness. For example, one of my teachers, a wonderful teacher named Andi has said in the past, one cannot be angry and mindful at the same moment. Now, this view stems from the Pali Abhidhamma, the Theravāda Abhidhamma tradition. The Abhidhamma is a codification of the Buddhist teaching in the centuries after the Buddha's death, attempting to, as I say, sort of put all of the Dharma into a more well-codified, well-structured form. And so, for example, one of the questions that comes up in the Abhidhamma is whether any particular state of mind is always wholesome, sometimes wholesome, or never wholesome. And mindfulness is a state that is categorized in the Theravāda Abhidhamma as always wholesome. However, as the scholar and practitioner Bhikkhu Analayo has pointed out, this picture doesn't accurately capture what we find in the suttas. In particular, in several suttas we find described, or at least mentioned, the possibility of what's called wrong mindfulness. Now, wrong mindfulness is not really well defined in the suttas, but we find, at least in some places, clues as to what might constitute wrong mindfulness. For example, in one early sutta, the Brahman Vasakara, claims that the Buddha praised all forms of meditation. And when hearing this, Ananda, the Buddha's close attendant, disagrees and says that in fact there were certain kinds of meditation that the Buddha did not praise. And what were those? Well, those were kinds of meditation that focused upon aspects of what we might term the 5 hindrances, that focused on anger, that focused on sense desire, that focused on doubt, that focused on sleepiness or restlessness and remorse. Any of those kinds of meditations the Buddha did not praise. Now, to be fair, in this particular sutta, the word that's used for meditation is the word jhana, which can, depending on the context, mean meditation generally, but it can also mean deep absorptive meditation. And so it's possible that what's under discussion here is an attempt to become very absorbed into meditations on anger, which of course would be particularly harmful. But it's probable, I would say, or at least arguable, that this very same argument could be made for a meditation like this using mindfulness. In other words, if we're going to spend our time mindfully simply absorbed in anger, we're not going to be doing ourselves any favors, and we're not engaged in anything but what might be termed wrong mindfulness. Now, in fact, we are given a very clear procedure in the early suttas about what we're supposed to do when we're in mindfulness meditation and these kinds of unwholesome states arise. We find this procedure, we find this practice outlined in fact, the fourth foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of dharmas. And in the mindfulness of dharmas, there is a discussion of how we're supposed to deal with the arising of the hindrances. It says, "And how does a mendicant meditate observing dharmas with respect to the 5 hindrances? It's when a mendicant who has sensual desire or anger and all the rest in them understands I have sensual desire, anger, and the rest in me. When they don't have sensual desire in them, they understand I don't have sensual desire in me. They understand how sensual desire arises, how, when it's already arisen, it's given up, and how, once it's given up, it doesn't arise again in the future." So that describes proper mindfulness practice. That is to say, when we find a state such as anger arising in the mind, we're aware of its arising, we try to find a way, we try to investigate a way to cause it not to arise. And once it has ceased arising, we're aware of that as well, and try to become aware of how we prevent it from arising again in the future. That is the general procedure we're to take in the fourth foundation of mindfulness. Now the question is how we reconcile this practice that we've just heard about from the fourth foundation of mindfulness. How do we reconcile that with the claim that we find in the abhidhamma that mindfulness is not compatible with the arising of anger? How are those things consistent? Well, there's a separate development within the abhidhamma known as the doctrine of momentariness, which I've discussed in prior videos. That is, that mental states are only arising for a split second, and then they are replaced by other mind states. And that these mind states are very short and they're even countable. We can sort of count one after the other. And that only one of them exists at a time. This is a doctrine I've described in a recent video as kind of the doctrine of seriality. These things happen in series. So the abhidhamma analysis of mindfulness of anger is that these states basically oscillate back and forth. We have a pure, unadulterated state of mindfulness that is then replaced in the next mind moment by an impure state of anger. And these oscillate back and forth between pure states and impure states. And that's what's going on when we claim to be mindful of anger. That is to say, these states alternate one to the other, as opposed to being both held in mind at the same time. According to the abhidhamma, they cannot be both held in mind at the same time, because one is wholesome, the other is unwholesome, and you can only have either a wholesome or an unwholesome mind state at a time. And as Analayo points out, we don't find this kind of elaboration in the suttas. In the suttas, what is described is that we are mindful of the anger. That is to say that the mindfulness and the anger occur simultaneously. And therefore, at least in Analayo's estimation, mindfulness cannot be a universally pure and wholesome state, because at times it's going to be intermixed with, let's say, anger. That is to say, with one or another of the hindrances when they arise and we are mindful of them. It might also be, as I've mentioned in a recent video, that there can be more than one mind state at a time arising in the mind, and therefore there could be a pure mindfulness arising simultaneously with an impure anger. It therefore might be that mindfulness is a completely pure state, but that it can coexist with other states like that that are not pure at the same time. This is, again, something that's not allowed in the abhidhamma, but it's not entirely clear why not. In any event, it seems clear from the suttas that part of proper mindfulness practice is our temporary embracing of unwholesome mental states, at least for the purposes of understanding them, so that we can let them go, and so that we can make sure in the future that they're less likely to arise. That is to say, we're to be aware of them when they're there, we're to be aware of them when they're absent, we're to be aware of how to make them go away when they are present, and when they're absent, we're to be aware of what will keep them from arising in the future. Now, this is obviously a lot to be mindful of. There's a lot of work that has to go on there. So in any event, when you hear about mindfulness, you may hear one of two things. You may hear that mindfulness is always wholesome and pure and can't co-arise with anger. And on the other hand, you may hear that we should always be mindful of our anger when it arises. And these two directives, these two kinds of practice, may seem mutually contradictory and therefore kind of confusing. My point here in this video is that these both stem from different interpretations of the Buddha's message. Now, if you want to hear an earlier video of mine on what meditation is not, I'll leave a link to that up here on the screen so you can hear more about that topic. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much for your attention, for all of your likes and support, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.